The Ligurian Sea looks harmless at night oil black, a smooth sheet broken only by a white comma of foam where a boat's prow parts the water. On a March evening in 1944, two small craft slide toward a rocky cove between train-lit villages. Behind the hills, the war never sleeps. On the water, 15 American soldiers grip their packs and the short fuses of a mission that, if it succeeds, will be a whisper no one hears, and if it fails, will echo for decades. They come ashore in uniform, boots slipping on pebbles slick with algae, helmets stifled by the damp salt air. Somewhere above them, a bell rings in a church tower. Somewhere inland, a train clatters through a tunnel whose stone ribs are their target. Their orders are simple and impossible. Reach the line, blow the tunnel, vanish into the green-brown folds of the hills before dawn. By morning, fishermen will find footprints where no footprints should be, a few impressions in the thistles above the strand. And then something else will push inland as well, a taut thread drawn through field telephones and scratchy radios, into a gray-painted office where a senior German officer smooths a paper with a palm, then hands it across his desk to a younger man with careful eyes. Count Alexander von Dohna-Schlobitten is a contradiction in a uniform. He was raised in an East Prussian manor house whose portraits of stern men and luminous women looked down through centuries of service to the state. He learned, as most of his class did, that duty runs like a cold river through life. You dip your hands in, you carry it with you, you wash your conscience in it. He also learned another lesson, quieter and older, from books and mentors and the muddy field exercises of the Reichswehr before the clap of boots and flags changed everything. There are rules to war, and some orders are meant to be refused. He is now adjutant to General Anton Dostler, commander of the German LXXV Army Corps in northwestern Italy, a man of iron spine and clipped phrases who has spent 2 world wars inside the grammar of obedience. The invasion of Italy has pushed German units into a tough, frayed defense from the beaches of Anzio to these narrow coastal strips where the mountains pitch down into the sea. The rail line that clings to these cliffs is a lifeline, pulsing ammunition, men, and hope north and south. A mission to snap that artery has the crisp logic of a field nap. Damage the tunnel, slow the trains, steal the breath of a front already gasping. A telephone buzzes. Another report dissolves into the room like smoke. Captured, 15 men, in uniform. They came over the water near Bonasala, or Framura names that sound like music when sung in peacetime. They were digging and hiding, and moving hesitantly under terraced olive trees. They were picked up by an Italian patrol and handed over under German guns. They carried explosive cord, pencil detonators, rations. They were American Army, not civilian saboteurs. They asked for a chaplain. They gave their names. They are now prisoners of war. The paper pushed toward Dohna is typed in the staccato of a field typewriter. It is blunt and thin, like a blade with the edge honed down to a single thought. A more polished phrasing is absent. The heavy words, the words that will hang in the air long after the ink dries, are in German that needs no translation in any era. Vorbefehl Führer's order. The Commando order. This directive, issued from the apex of the state in October 1942, has crawled through 2 winters into every theater of war like frost under a door. It says what everyone understands. Enemy commandos and saboteurs are to be annihilated, even if they are in uniform, even if they surrender. The old rules no longer apply to those who fight outside boundaries. Dohna reads. He has read this order before, in staff briefings, in the precise paragraphs of the Wehrmacht's shivering relationship to international law. He knows the Geneva Convention's ink, how it promises protection to those who wear a uniform, who carry arms openly, who do not pretend it's civilian life. He knows how often the black-letter promises of treaties have wilted in the heat of the Eastern Front, in partisan wars, on cold roads lined with civilians who did not run quickly enough. He knows, too, that Italy has become a laboratory for improvisation, where the boundaries between soldier and saboteur blur among vineyards and marl, and men who know every goat path better than any map. He looks up, somewhere past the glass, beyond the mild face of March. There are men in a makeshift cell in La Spezia, or Levanto, or some village police station. Men with dirt under their nails from digging in a rocky hillside. Men who are 30 years old, or 21 or 45, thinking about the smell of the ocean and the strange lights on the far side of the bay. Their mission has failed. Their lives have not yet failed them. General Dostler's jaw murmurs forward as he speaks. He has the calm of someone who knows which will win a scale. He repeats what the staff have repeated for months. This order comes from the top. It has not been rescinded. Failing to obey is not an option. He will be asked to account for things after the war. Yes, but the war is still going on. The railway must not be blown. The Americans must not be allowed to test the edges of the rules. Discipline at the front begins here, in the office, with ink and signatures. Dohna holds the paper a moment longer, long enough for the whirring silence of the corridor to become a presence in the room. There are moments in history when a person's entire life funnels down into the thickness of a pen stroke. He thinks of his grandfather's books and his father's silence, and of the way snow falls in East Prussia soundless, heavily, covering everything the previous season has done. He places the paper back on the desk. His refusal is simple. This is a violation of the law of war. He will not sign. He will not put his name to an execution order for prisoners of war taken in uniform. He will not carry this command forward at this desk, under this ceiling, inside this tide of wood and steel and fear. He watches the muscles around his superior's eyes flicker and settle. History tends to turn on explosions and invasions, on the clash of battalions and the hoist of flags. Yet it also turns on the cup of coffee left untouched, on a line that is not signed, on a young officer in a gray service tunic telling a general that the order on the blotter is not a military matter but a moral one. The doors remain closed. Outside, the wind picks up and the sea moves with a muscle's slow flex. Somewhere in the hills, a train mouths a tunnel and comes out the other side intact. Somewhere in a village cell, 15 men listen for footsteps on the stairs. In the balance between obedience and conscience, we like to imagine that great costs buy great outcomes, that refusing will stop the machine, that saying no will save 15 lives. But this war has gone past the point where one man's no can change its direction. And yet, as the scene unfolds and the order is taken away to be signed by someone else, and a dismissal is already forming in the air, like rain, the refusal plants itself in the record like a stake in hard ground, and the ground remembers. Wars are calendars of dates and facefuls of wind. Long before those 15 Americans launched toward the Ligurian shore, another set of men, in another room lit by green desk lamps, inked a page that would unwind into their lives. October 18th, 1942. The Führer's headquarters. The Kommandobefehl the Commando order. Its language is meticulous and violent, as if the precision of its German could put a legal gloss on what it proposed. It declared that all enemy soldiers engaged in commando activities were to be killed without mercy, even after they surrendered, even if they were in uniform. It took aim not at an army in line, but at the idea that war might be limited by rules. Hitler's directive did not spring from nothing. The war had become a swarm of raids and sabotage. British Commando small units raised for coastal operations had landed on beaches in Norway. In France, along the Channel, had attacked installations like needles tapping a cord. Dieppe, in August 1942, a raid with a high cost tightened German fear of raiders. Counterinsurgency work on the Eastern Front further eroded distinctions between civilian and soldier in German doctrine. The Kommandobefehl became both an instrument of terror and a justification, a way to tell troops that this battle no longer had clear edges. For some German commanders, men with long memories of field manuals and the Hague Conventions, the order smelled wrong. It was recorded in war diaries, received in commands up and down the hierarchy, sometimes with a private caution, "Be careful." Others, especially those enmeshed with SS methods, or twisted by the anti-partisan brutality of the East, accepted it as the way things were now. The line between the Wehrmacht and the SS was never as clean as veterans later liked to remember. Many regular army units complied readily enough when told to step over. Italy, by 1944, was frayed in every sense. Mussolini had been deposed, rescued, and resurrected as the figurehead of a German-propped republic in the north. Germans under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring held a hard defensive line that zigzagged from coast to coast, using all the blunt instruments terrain and engineering allowed. Supplies flowed where rails and roads allowed them to flow. The coastal railway from Genoa to La Spezia was a spinal cord. On the Allied side, the Office of Strategic Services, the American Intelligence and Special Operations Agency, incubated in the fire of this conflict, sought to weaken that spine. Among the men chosen were engineers and infantrymen, a handful of Italian speakers, all trained just enough to clamber ashore and plant charges on a tunnel. Had not practice been what it was? Brief, hurried, in the backwash of too many priorities. The mission took a code name soft enough to sound like a nickname. Ginny. Ginny I tried and failed. Weather and poor intelligence pushed the men back onto their boats without touching land. The tunnel remained a dark throat, swallowing trains. But war takes the same river twice. Ginny, too, would try again. In March 1944, with Corsica as an Allied base and the Ligurian coast within reach, they set off in the familiar two-boat formation, each soldier carrying the small, sharp confidence that the second time will succeed where the first failed. They landed near Framura. The cliffs here have the arrogance of polished stone. Stairs cut into rock are so old they look natural. The olive terraces are stitched to the slope with dry walls and stubbornness. In daylight, the view of the sea could make even a soldier catch his breath. But daylight is what they do not have. They move inland under the stained black shapes of pines, trying to gauge distance by the hum of the rail and the taste of metal in the air when trains pass. Yet Italy is tight with people. Eyes are everywhere. Fishermen with torches, women who carry news in baskets, carabinieri whose uniforms still smell of a monarchy that has technically ceased to exist. The men of Ginny, too, are in U.S. uniforms, which they believe will protect them if the worst happens. If they are captured, they will say their names their serial numbers, their mission if asked. They will be POWs. Their officers know the danger of capture in a special operation. They also know the Geneva Convention of 1929 covers them. They are not saboteurs in civilian clothes. They are soldiers. The next day, they are seen and then found. Some hide in scrub that stabs like wire. Others are pulled from crevices in the terraces. The Italian fascist militia bring them in, half braggart, half bored, with faces that know the local woods and the likely paths down to sea. They are transferred to German custody. Papers are checked with the unsentimental efficiency of a machine that has been running a long time. Their mission is clear from the gear. Their status as soldiers is clear from the cloth on their shoulders. News moves up the chain. In La Spezia, in a German headquarters taking up the clean lines of a municipal building, telephones begin to trill the same note. Prisoners. 15. Americans. Commandos. In uniform. The words rattle like dice. The staff gather those words like small stones and bring them where such stones become a wall, to General Dostler's desk. Dostler is not a cartoon of fanaticism. He is a career officer, a man of artillery and staff postings and the discipline of appointments. He knows that this war is unwinding. He knows that his duty is to a chain that still runs unbroken to Berlin in March 1944, knows the Commando order by heart, and what ignoring it would mean for his career, and possibly for his life. He also knows, because he has a law professor's clarity on his staff, in the person of Dohna, that legal arguments exist against it. He weighs all of this before breakfast. We imagine these moments as melodramatic, the sort of scene in which a man stares at a portrait on the wall and decides. Often, it is less operatic. The staff officer clears his throat. The order is not new. It is simply applied to a new circumstance. The prisoners are here. The field punishments are specified. Immediate execution. If one has done this once, the second time is easier. For those who have not, the choice is whether to be the kind of officer who follows orders, or the kind who is removed for refusing to obey. Count Alexander von Dohna-Schlobitten is not a common character in popular memory. He did not command armies or lose a city. He inhabited the small but crucial ecosystem of the staff, the grease that keeps the gears of an army turning. The son of a lineage rooted in East Prussia, he had absorbed the old Prussian virtues and the new German realities. He is not a hero in the loud sense. He is a man who knows where the lines are and who steps back when asked to cross. When the paper comes, it carries the weight of that imperial vocabulary. Friedrich, Wehrmacht, Führer, Befehl. It carries authority like a smell. Dohna reads, and past the silences of the room, one hears the older language of war law. Uniform, surrender, protection. He tells his general what he believes and knows, that the order cannot apply to soldiers captured in uniform. He has read the convention. He believes an officer's honor is not an antique decoration, but a living requirement. It is not an argument that wins. By the time the coffee on someone's desk has cooled, the decision has been made. The commando order will be treated as binding. The execution will go ahead. Dohna's refusal to sign will be noted in the most immediate way. This is an army. Men who refuse are dismissed. Titles like Count and families like his do not protect you from an irritated general trying to keep his command from looking weak to superiors who prefer terrible clarity to messy decency. So out of a small Italian city, at the end of winter, 2 convoys begin to move. One takes a set of Americans to a bare place near the sea, where white rock shines even under a thin sky. Another, invisible, takes a Prussian aristocrat to the edge of his career. Both will leave marks that outlast their creators. The Ligurian wind scrapes the face like salt, and the gulls are restless, and trains go on burrowing through the hills. The words of the Kommandobefehl, born in a very different season, settle like dust over everything. There are rooms that go quiet while something real is happening. We do not see the moment when Dohna stands up straight and says no. We can see it only reflected in the records of a trial later, in the way other men recall it, with the mix of respect and irritation reserved for those who remind you that conscience exists. We know enough. The general's adjutant announced that the shooting of prisoners in uniform violated international law. He refused to carry the order forward. He was dismissed and replaced on the spot. Some refusals are dramatic. Some are stubbornly procedural. What Dohna did was administrative courage, the kind that requires you to turn away a piece of paper and take the consequences. He did not shout. He did not resign to applause. He made himself very small in the machinery, and by becoming small, jammed the gears for an instant. In a war of whirlwinds, his gesture is a quiet, unyielding stone. The order marched on without his signature. Another officer signed. Soldiers down the chain unlimbered the words and fitted them to action. Guard posts stiffened. A place was chosen. On the coast south of La Spezia, Punta Bianca throws its white shoulder into the sea. It is a lovely name for a hard place. Under weather that changes more than the politics on shore, a firing party can be assembled in minutes, as long as there is a reason. There is now a reason written on paper with a letterhead. The 15 prisoner soldiers, in the same way their captors are soldiers, were told. Perhaps they understood at once. Perhaps they believed in the treaty text they had been taught. The Allied armies drilled their men to give only name, rank, and serial number, to say no more, to expect no mercy, and to rely on the law. Some had heard rumors of this German order that cut through the law like a blade through cloth. Some had not. To be a prisoner is to be removed from the rhythm of choice and tossed into the rhythm of other people's decisions. There are statements that they asked for a chaplain and that none came, that they prayed anyway, that they shared a last cigarette, that they stood straight, that they were tied, that they were not. The sources are not unanimous on such details, because witnesses were not taking notes for posterity. What is clear is brutal enough. They were taken in small groups or all together to the chosen place and shot. The sound traveled across water and bounced off white stone. The sea crowded close, indifferent. In the moment of the volley, one broad doctrine of modern war collided with the older doctrine it had been built upon. War changes, we are told. Blurred lines, total conflict, existential stakes. That kind of talk has a way of making cruelty seem like cleverness. But standing on that white rock are 15 men whose only real act of war was to come ashore in uniform under orders and try to break a tunnel. They were not spies. They did not pretend to be villagers. They were soldiers. There has to be a place in our memory where this collision remains visible, not blurred by the fog of what-ifs and the lawyer's quicksilver. What was the cost to the man who refused? Dohna was told to leave. He lost his position, the future he might have had in the service he had spent his life in. He did not save those men. That part of our appetite for simple morality one man refuses, and the gun lowers must be starved here. The machine was too large. the decision too favored by men further up. The order had the charisma of authority. It would not be stopped by a single adjutant. He knows this when he speaks, and likely knows it afterward, when he is walking down a corridor and someone looks away. Yet he refuses all the same. It is worth lingering on why. Soldiers and officers are taught two things that grow alongside each other, and sometimes strangle: obey and know the law. The law says that those who surrender in uniform, under arms, are protected. The law says that there is a category of prisoner who moves out of the realm of battle into a space of custody. To kill them is not war. It is something else. The Kommandobefehl asked officers to pretend those categories did not exist. It asked men to murder with a straight back and the confidence that they were obeying. There were men who thought the end of the war justified this. There were men who no longer believed in any law. Dohna's refusal is as much about shame as about law. He is not a lawyer. He is an aristocrat with a memory of old Prussian strictures, about honor strictures often romanticized, sometimes invoked to cover brutality, but at their best, unfashionable demands that kept something human alive in a profession designed to take human life. His family estate back in East Prussia could have served as a museum of such high-minded contradictions. He carries that museum with him in his bones. It is easy to think the German army was a monolith of either obedience or cruelty. The reality is a mottled hide. There were men like General Erwin Rommel, praised for chivalry in North Africa, who nonetheless distributed and applied the commando order in his theater, believing it a necessity or choosing not to resist. There were men like General Dietrich von Choltitz, who would later refuse to destroy Paris, and men who followed orders to burn villages on the Eastern Front without blinking. An army is a nation in uniform, and this nation had allowed itself to be taught that orders from above had moral weight simply by being orders. If we're honest, that appeal to obedience does not belong to one nation or one time. In La Spezia, the paperwork ended in gunfire. In a suite of rooms lighted by windows taller than a man, after the echo drained away, someone signed the receipt of a report. Execution carried out. Someone else noted. Adjutant dismissed. Worlds end with bangs and whimpers, and also with stamps and initials. For the families of the 15, the world ends in a letter that will not tell them what happened by a white cliff on the other side of the ocean. It will say, missing for a time, then presumed dead. The grammar of loss meets the bureaucracy of the military, and the result is a thin envelope that cannot carry its own weight. In the web of cause and effect that war spins, the moral isolation of a man like Dohna is part of the point. The system is designed to make resistance look futile and then to punish it. But systems forget. Records remember. The question asked later will be simple. Who tried to stop this? And in this case, a single name surfaces, not as a savior, but as someone who put his finger on the scale and said what it should read. It still did not tip. Yet later, in a courtroom, the word refusal will have the sound of truth. In that moment by the desk, in the silence in which he returns the paper, Dohna makes a future hearing possible. That's not a romantic consolation for 15 graves. It is, however, how accountability comes to war the way dawn comes to a coastline like this. Late, slow, and with light that shows exactly where the rocks are. After the shots at Punta Bianca, the Ligurian spring moved forward with the insolence of seasons. The rail lines still ran, though more carefully. Allied planes sowed the sky with contrails and the sea with wakes. The 15 Americans were buried in shallow ground, the kind that gives dead men back when asked firmly enough. Word of their fate spread as rumor. Rumor hardened into reports. Reports hardened into a case. By the end of 1945, the war's clocks had stopped on spectrums of horror. The Allied powers, assembling their tribunals and their principals, faced a landscape of crimes ranging from the industrial annihilation of civilians to the fiercely debated gray spaces of military necessity. The United States convened a military commission in Italy to try General Anton Dostler for the murders at La Spezia. It was one of the earliest such trials, overshadowed in memory by Nuremberg, but crucial for setting bones in the legal skeleton. The charge was simple in form and complex in implication. Dostler, as commander, ordered the execution of 15 captured U.S. soldiers, in uniform, in violation of the laws and customs of war. He pleaded not guilty. His defense leaned on a familiar beam superior orders. He argued he acted under the Kommandobefehl, signed by Hitler, disseminated and binding. He pointed up the chain, to Field Marshal Kesselring and beyond, to the idea that the order was the air everyone breathed in that year of the war. He argued that as a subordinate, he could not interpret away a directive from the Führer. To do so was treason, in any case likely futile. The prosecution's pivot was equally clear. Obedience to a manifestly illegal order is no defense. The Americans were in uniform. They carried arms openly. They were captured, held, and then executed. Whatever one thinks of commando operations, the law as written and understood protected them. Additional ballast came from inside Dostler's own headquarters. The testimony that not everyone agreed, not everyone signed proof that the clarity of illegality was visible even in the heat of wartime. Count Alexander von Dohna-Schlobitten was called to testify. He told the tribunal what he had told his general, that the order violated the law of war, that he had refused to carry it out, and had been dismissed. Here the importance of his earlier silence breaking becomes sharp. Trials climb ladders of proof, one rung at a time. To establish that an order is illegal, you must show that its illegality was recognizable, not only to learned lawyers in calm rooms, but to soldiers under pressure. When a staff officer says he saw and knew, says he spoke and was punished, it makes the argument not abstract, but present tense and believable. The tribunal could look at Dostler and say, "Among your own, voices told you this was wrong. You chose to ignore them. Responsibility walks with you." The commission convicted Dostler and sentenced him to death. On December 1st, 1945, in Avossa, Italy, he was executed by a U.S. Army firing squad. The photographs of his last minutes still circulate in books and online grainy. Careful images of a general being strapped to a post, his eyes blindfolded, his jaw set in a hardness that looks, if we're honest, like the mask of a man who cannot believe his own chain of obedience has snapped around his throat. Legal scholars later cite the case as a cornerstone for the principle that obeying a superior's order is not a complete defense for war crimes. The commander's responsibility is active, not passive. This was refined and echoed at Nuremberg, and in legislations and manuals in armies that would fight wars far from Italy in later decades. The Dostler case is one of those footnotes that became a footbridge. It is taught quietly to officers in classes about rules of engagement and lawful commands, part of the grammar of modern military conduct. For the families of the dead Americans, the tribunal was a very public acknowledgement that what happened to their sons was a crime and not simply a misfortune of war. Bodies were exhumed. Evidence was assembled rope fibers. bullet marks in stone, shrapnel that never flew because charges were never set. Some remains were reburied in U.S. cemeteries in Italy. Others later came home. The graves are in neat rows. The white stones catch the light in similar ways, whether the cemetery looks over Tuscan hills or an American valley. And what of the officer who refused? Dohna survived the war. He returned to East Prussia for a time, only to be swept again by history, by Soviet armies, by the end of an old world. His family, like so many of his class, lost its estate, its angers. He later wrote about that vanished world with a steady, elegiac hand. He did not make of his refusal a public monument. He was not the kind to give interviews in which the past is polished, but he had placed his name where it needed to do its work, on the page of a transcript in which a general admits, in effect, that he could have chosen differently. The Ginny operation, in the larger scheme, did not change the war. The tunnel withstood not only that night, but many others. The Allied armies advanced in Italy, not through sabotage, but through slow, costly attrition. Through the Gustav Line in Cassino, through Anzio's killing beaches, through Rome and up the spine, until finally they cracked the Gothic line and shook hands with other armies on other roads. The men who died at Punta Bianca rarely appear in film or in histories with wide chapters on strategy. Yet there are surprising facts that stay, that the men were in proper uniform, not saboteurs in jeans, that the Wehrmacht knew the law and chose to ignore it, that someone inside the German command told the general to his face that this was wrong, that a German general was executed in Italy not for killing civilians in a pogrom or ordering extermination, but for ordering the murder of 15 POWs. The war's biggest crimes are so large that the mind shrinks from them. These 15 are human-sized, painfully easy to imagine, situated at a white cliff where we can stand and hear the sea. Walk the coast today, and you might find no sign of any of it. The Mediterranean insists on sunlight and lunch and weddings. Trains still lick their way along the shore, unself-consciously, but the archive remains. It sits in boxes in Washington, in Berlin and Rome, in handwriting and typewriter ribbon. It records that in a single command post in northern Italy, in late March of 1944, an officer declined to pass an illegal order on to subordinates. It is the kind of fact that prevents the easy lie that everyone did what they had to. It prevents the exculpating fog that covers responsibility with the words, "no choice." These are not only historical curiosities. They are cautionary tales. Armies go to war with more than weapons. They go with rules and with human beings tasked with knowing what those rules mean. Training manuals can be revised. PowerPoints can explain the hierarchy of law. In the end, the integrity of a lieutenant colonel or a captain or an adjutant, somewhere in a hallway, somewhere at a desk, remains the narrow throat through which a great deal of right and wrong must pass. Tell a story long enough, and it sounds like a parable. A white cliff, a violated law, a general on a post, an officer who refused. But the texture of it is concrete, the thickness of paper, the smell of salt, the skim of dust on a windowsill in an Italian office where someone leaned as they thought. This happened. It did not fix the day. It happened in the way we would like. It did not save the men it should have saved. It did something else. It left a record that trained light on responsibility when the war had drained away. We like our moral victories to come with trumpets. More common are these losses that leave behind a compass. What Count Alexander von Dohna-Schlobitten did was both small and exact. He declined to abet a crime. He endorsed the law of war without pretending that it was a set of magic words. He told the truth to power at a moment when power did not care. The consequence was personal and immediate. He was dismissed. The consequence was also historical and extended. His refusal was a hinge in a case that wrote a principle into the living code of armies, not only Germany's, not only America's. It is tempting, 7 or 8 decades later, to collect the courage of the Second World War into one box. People who hid families in annexes, who blew up bridges, who signed their names to plots against a tyrant, who defected, who died. Include in that box the quieter acts that occur in the administrative spine of conflict. Someone says, "I will not falsify this report." Someone else says, "I will not sign this order." Such acts rarely rescue the immediate victims. The machine usually has another lever to pull. But those acts carve lines that can be seen later when history is sorted in light and shade. Those lines become the legal lanes our soldiers and officers drive in now. There is a tendency to flatten the Wehrmacht into a single smooth slab of culpability or exoneration. Neither is accurate. The German army fought a brutally expansionist war and participated at multiple levels in atrocity. That is an anchor truth. In the creases of that truth are individuals whose decisions either deepened the darkness or lit small lamps. Dohna did not stop a genocide. He did not desert. He did not mutiny. He stayed within his profession and chose not to become a murderer by ink. In that, he stands with a minor pantheon of officers across wars who have said to their commanders and peers, "This is the edge." The men of Ginny, too, are every soldier who has ever walked into the dark with an order in his pocket and found a fate between paper and terrain. They were not spy masters in sables. They were soldiers doing a dangerous task. Their story does not rewrite the campaign in Italy. It rewrites a line in the manual. It governs what may be done to them. It turns a clause from theory into blood. The white stones above the Ligurian Sea and the white stones in military cemeteries far from that sea speak to each other in a language of names and dates and the silence between them. Walk the old battlegrounds. Look for the rooms where decisions were made. They are not always in palaces. They are often in municipal buildings or schoolhouses, in offices with coats on pegs and a pot plant dying for lack of light. The people who sit in those chairs are not arch-villains. They are men and women having a bad morning who must decide whether to pass a paper along. When we teach the laws of war, when we train officers, when we tell our children what this past is for, we might dwell longer on those rooms. We might remind ourselves that civilization does not only fetch up on beaches or argue itself in parliaments. It is also the refusal to expedite a wrong when the path of least resistance is clear. The afterlife of a refusal is not a monument, but a practice. It is found in a lieutenant who tells a sergeant to stop striking a prisoner, in a pilot who declines to bomb when the target is a school, not a depot, in a corporal who speaks up when civilians are mistreated on patrol. These are not rhetorical gestures. They are risky, sometimes career-ending. They also form the lattice that supports our claim to be different from those we condemn. Do not romanticize. There was no rescue. There was no stay of execution at the last minute at Punta Bianca. The men died and their families grieved, and the war rolled forward. But the law hardened around what happened. Names sat beside facts in a tribunal where the defendant had to listen to the words of the man he had brushed off. The camera closed on a general strapped to a post. Somewhere in East Prussia, under a sky that had become foreign, a former adjutant put the small, stubborn comfort of a choice made into the bag of things a person carries through life. He would stand in other lines for other papers in a New Germany, where the word law could be pronounced without glancing over one's shoulder. The German officer who refused to shoot POWs reminds us that courage is not always heroic in the way storytellers prefer. Sometimes it is polite, firm, said in a low voice. Sometimes it involves losing your job rather than your life. Sometimes its power is delayed delivered, not to the victims but to the future, which needs precedence to stand on when it punishes the powerful. If you are looking for a lesson to take with you, carry this. The rules matter most when they are hardest to keep, and the people who keep them will often look very ordinary. The call is not to grand gestures few of us will ever have to make, but to the daily refusal to allow expedience to dictate morality. The world is always drafting its next commando order in the language of necessity, emergency, efficiency. Someone has to read it, and then say what Alexander von Dohna-Schlobitten said in that Italian office, when the sea could be heard if you open the window. No, this is illegal. I will not sign. On a coast banded with light, a train still runs through a tunnel that men once tried to stop. The sea throws its spray against the stone in the old rhythm. Memory, too, is rhythmic. If we keep it, if we return to these rooms and these cliffs and those fragments of paper, we stand a better chance of preserving the fragile thing our grandparents bought with their blood. A world in which even in war, we say there are things we will not do.